When you keep chasing but never reach the finish line. Have you ever wondered why, despite achieving so much in life, there's always this nagging feeling that something's missing? Maybe it's a better job, a more perfect relationship, or simply that sense of peace you think you'll have someday. That feeling isn't loud or screaming, but it's always there, like a persistent whisper saying, "You're not good enough. You don't have enough. You're nobody yet." We live in a world that constantly reminds us of what we lack. Not enough money, not enough success, not enough recognition, not enough love, not enough meaning. And each time we feel this lack, we place our faith in a new goal, a new plan, a better version of ourselves. But when we achieve it, the satisfaction lasts only briefly before that feeling of lack returns, this time wearing a different mask. So what's really going on? Is life inherently lacking? Or has the way we perceive ourselves created an endless loop? And if so, who or what is feeling this lack? The answer lies in a place few dare to look directly at. The very structure of the ego, what we believe to be ourselves, is designed to never feel enough. Not because life is lacking anything, but because the nature of the ego itself is lack. It exists through constantly becoming, constantly achieving, constantly proving. And if one day it stops feeling lack, it will have no reason to exist. This article isn't here to give you another self-improvement formula. It's an invitation to stop and look directly at the psychological machinery that's been running your entire life without ever being questioned. When you clearly see the mechanism of lack, not through theory but through direct observation, a door opens, not to a better version of you, but to freedom from the very need to become someone. The ego, a structure fed by lack. From childhood, we learn to exist through comparison. A child gets praised for doing well, criticized for doing wrong. They learn that love and acceptance aren't givens. They must be earned. Gradually, an idea forms. I need to become someone to be worthy. And from there, the ego is born, not as a fixed entity, but as a relentless process of constructing an image of oneself. This ego isn't you. It's a collection of stories, beliefs, and memories stitched together into a continuous sense of who I am. But if you observe closely, you'll see it never stands still. It's always in a state of becoming richer, smarter, more loved, more meaningful. And this very movement, this endless pursuit, is what sustains its existence. Imagine a spinning top. It only stands upright while spinning. When it stops spinning, it falls. The ego is the same. It lives through motion, through always having something to achieve, something to worry about, something to solve. If there's nothing left to strive for, no problem to think about, no future to move toward, the ego loses its foundation. And that, for the ego, is death. This is why the ego cannot allow you to feel enough. It needs incompleteness as fuel. Each time you achieve something, it quickly creates a new gap. You might notice this in moments of success, a fleeting joy, then immediately a question creeps in. So what's next? Not because you're greedy or don't know when enough is enough, but because the psychological structure of the ego is designed to never rest. And here's the scariest part. We've lived with this ego so long that we believe it is us. We believe the feeling of lack is real, that it reflects an actual deficiency in life. But the truth is, what's feeling the lack is itself an illusion, a psychological structure with no substance, yet it has occupied your entire living experience. When you begin to see this clearly, not through theory, but through direct observation, something strange happens. You realize you don't need to fix the ego, don't need to make it feel enough, because trying to do so is precisely how it continues to exist. Freedom doesn't come from meeting the ego's needs, but from seeing through its illusory nature. Fear of emptiness. If you spend a little time sitting still, doing nothing, not scrolling your phone, not listening to music, not thinking about plans, just simply being there, you'll start to feel a vague unease. It's not fear of a specific threat, but an uncomfortable feeling, as if something's wrong when you're doing nothing. That's the voice of the ego, panicking because it has nothing to cling to. The ego fears emptiness more than anything, because in emptiness, there's nothing for it to define itself by. No problem to solve, no goal to achieve, no story to tell. And when there's no story, the ego doesn't exist. That's why it will do anything to fill the void, create anxiety, pull you into past memories, paint future scenarios, or simply keep you busy with unnecessary tasks. This is why many people can't stand silence. Not because silence is scary, but because in silence, the ego has no hiding place. It's forced to face its own lack of substance. And instead of allowing that to happen, it creates noise, whether anxiety, daydreaming, guilt, or hope. Anything, as long as it doesn't have to face emptiness. But what the ego doesn't tell you is the emptiness it fears isn't nothingness. It's the space in which real life can be present. When a mind is no longer occupied by pursuit, by the story of self, then another dimension of experience opens up. Not emptiness in the sense of deprivation, but a fullness of emptiness, where everything can appear without being distorted by the ego's filter. But to get there, you must be willing to face this fear, not by fighting it, but by looking straight at it. When you see clearly that the fear of emptiness is just the ego protecting itself, it loses its power. And in that moment, you can experience what the ego never wants you to know. That presence needs no story, that life needs no proof, that you don't need to become anyone to exist completely. The illusion of later. One of the ego's most subtle tricks is creating the illusion of the future. It whispers, if I achieve this, I'll be at peace. If I understand that, I'll be free. If I become like that, I'll be happy. And you believe it. You place your faith in some future moment when everything will be okay, when you'll feel enough. But look back at your life. How many times have you thought that achieving something would satisfy you? And how many times after achieving it, did you find yourself aiming for another goal? Not because the previous goal wasn't good enough, but because the ego never lives in the present. It only exists in time, in the past as memory, in the future as hope. And because of this, it cannot experience fullness, because fullness can only exist here, now. The illusion of later is a perfect trap. It allows the ego to continue existing by promising that liberation lies ahead. Just try a little harder. Just learn one more thing. Just change one more habit, and you run. You run not because you truly believe you'll reach the destination, but because the running itself makes you feel like you're doing something meaningful. It gives the ego a reason to exist. But the truth is, there is no later. There's only now. And in this now, if you don't carry the story of lack, then nothing is lacking. Peace isn't a state to be achieved. It's what remains when the ego stops creating conflict. Freedom isn't the result of a long process. It's the realization that you were never imprisoned, except by belief in the ego itself. When you see this illusion clearly, not intellectually, but through direct observation, something miraculous happens. You stop postponing life. You stop living as if happiness is a destination. And in that stopping, you discover that what you've been seeking has always been here, not as something you possess, but as the very nature of presence when it's not obscured by the ego's noise. The never-ending cycle. Observe this cycle in your own life. You desire something. You work to achieve it. When you achieve it, there's a brief moment of satisfaction, maybe a few hours, a few days, even a few weeks. But then, like a receding wave, the feeling of fullness disappears and a new desire emerges. It may not have the same shape, the same content, but the structure is identical. I need this to feel complete. This isn't a sign of greed or weakness. This is how the ego operates. It cannot stop because its nature is movement. Like a fish can't live outside water, the ego can't live in stillness. It needs problems to solve, gaps to close, futures to move toward. And each time one cycle ends, it immediately starts a new one. What's noteworthy is you can see this clearly in people who've achieved everything society considers success. They have money, fame, power, but they're still not at peace. Because the ego doesn't care about the content of achievement. It only cares about the process. It lives through the chase, not through the catch. That's why, no matter how much you have, it will always find something still missing. And this is where most people get stuck. They think the problem is not achieving the right thing. Maybe it's not money. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's life's meaning. Maybe it's enlightenment. And they keep running, this time with a different goal. But as long as what's running is still the ego, the destination will forever recede. Freedom doesn't come from finding the right goal. It comes from seeing through the entire structure of pursuit. When you see clearly that the ego can never feel enough, not because it doesn't have enough, but because its nature is lack, then you stop seeking solutions within the same pattern. You don't try to make the ego feel full. You simply see it, and in that seeing, a space opens up, a space in which life needs to prove nothing. When clear seeing replaces reaction. Most of us have spent our entire lives reacting to the feeling of lack. When it appears, we try to fill it with action, with plans, with shopping, with relationships, with knowledge. But each time we react, we reinforce the belief that the feeling of lack is real, that it needs to be solved. And this reaction itself, however reasonable it seems, is how the ego maintains its existence. But there's another way. Instead of reacting, you can simply observe. When the feeling of lack appears, whether it's lack of money, lack of love, lack of meaning, instead of immediately trying to fix it, stop and look at it. No judgment, no analysis, no attempt to change it. Simply see, this is the feeling of lack. This is how the ego is operating. In this non-reactive observation, something strange happens. The feeling of lack no longer has the same power. Because when you don't feed it with reaction, it has nothing to cling to. It's like a fire without fuel. It may burn for a while, but then it extinguishes itself. And what remains isn't a frightening emptiness, but a quiet presence, needing nothing to be complete. This isn't a technique to achieve peace. It's not another method the ego can use to improve itself. It's the direct realization that when you don't interfere, when you don't try to fix or escape, then what's feeling the lack, the ego itself, loses its foundation to exist. And in its absence, you discover that nothing is lacking. Never was. This is the key to freedom. Not freedom to have more, but freedom from the very need to have more. Not freedom to become someone, but freedom from the idea that you need to become. And this freedom isn't in the future, isn't the result of a long journey. It's always available, right in this moment, when you stop believing the story of lack. Practice. Observe the feeling of lack when it appears. In the first week, start by simply noticing the moments when the feeling of lack appears in your daily life. Don't try to change or fix anything, just recognize it. It might be when you're scrolling social media and someone else's life seems better and a vague feeling of dissatisfaction creeps in. It might be when you complete a task, but instead of feeling satisfied, you immediately think of the next thing to do. It might be when you're alone and feel you need to do something, need to fill the void with sound, images, or thoughts. Each time you notice this feeling, pause for a few seconds. Name it simply. This is the feeling of lack. Don't judge it as good or bad. Don't try to explain why it appeared. Just acknowledge its presence. You can write it down in a small notebook. What time, what situation, and what the feeling of lack relates to lack of money, lack of recognition, lack of love, lack of meaning. This recording isn't for analysis, but to create distance between you and the feeling. So you begin to see that it's not you, but just a phenomenon occurring. After a few days of practice, you'll start to notice something astonishing. The feeling of lack appears more frequently than you thought. It's not just in moments of crisis or stress, but almost like a silent background to everyday experience. Even when everything's fine, there's still a whisper that something's missing. Seeing this clearly isn't to make you feel bad about yourself, but to start questioning. Does this feeling reflect reality, or is it just how the ego maintains its existence? Sit still with discomfort without reacting. In the second week, spend 10 to 15 minutes each day sitting still in complete silence. No music, no guided meditation, no goals at all. Simply sit and let whatever appears appear. In the first few minutes, the mind might be relatively quiet, but then an unease will start creeping in. It might come as thoughts. I'm wasting time. I should be doing something more useful. Or as physical sensations, an itch, an urge to stand up, tension in the body. This is the ego reacting to emptiness. Instead of standing up or doing something to dispel this feeling, stay with it. Observe it as if you're watching a natural phenomenon, like watching clouds drift or waves crash. Notice how it tries to convince you that you must do something. Notice how it creates reasonable justifications. Sitting here is meaningless. I have more important things to do. But don't believe those reasons. Just see them as thoughts appearing. The miraculous thing is, if you don't react, if you don't stand up or get swept in the stream of thought, the unease will peak and then begin to dissolve. It's like a wave. It rises, reaches its peak, then recedes. And when it recedes, a different quietness appears. Not a quietness you created, but the quietness that's inherent when the ego stops creating noise. In those moments, you might glimpse a state of presence that needs nothing to be complete. Maybe in the first few days, you won't be able to sit still for 15 minutes. That's okay. What matters isn't the duration, but the quality of observation. Even 5 minutes of non-reactive observation is more valuable than 30 minutes of sitting while the mind wanders. And gradually, as you become accustomed to facing this unease, it will lose its power. You'll see that it's not a real threat, but just the ego's way of trying to keep you under its control. Ask who is feeling the lack. After 2 weeks of basic practice, you started getting used to observing the feeling of lack and sitting still with unease. Now it's time to go deeper with a simple but powerful question. Who is feeling the lack? This isn't a philosophical question to ponder, but a tool to look directly at the structure of the ego. When the feeling of lack appears, say you're feeling a lack of recognition at work, instead of immediately getting swept into the story about why you deserve more recognition, stop and ask, who is feeling the lack of recognition? The natural answer will be, I am. But don't stop there. Ask further, who am I? Not to find a verbal answer, but to look at what's feeling the lack. If you observe deeply enough, you'll see that the I feeling the lack isn't a fixed entity. It's a collection of thoughts, self-images, memories of the past, and expectations of the future. It's a story. I'm someone who's worked hard. I deserve recognition. I feel overlooked. But if you peel away each layer of this story, you won't find a real I at all. Only thoughts appearing and disappearing. This practice might cause some initial confusion because it touches the foundation of how you've lived your entire life. But don't fear that confusion. It's a sign that you're starting to see through the illusion. Practice this question many times throughout the day, especially in moments when the feeling of lack is strong. Each time you ask, you create distance between awareness and the ego. And in that distance, a freedom begins to emerge. Not freedom of the ego, but freedom from the ego. Live from fullness instead of lack. When you practiced the first 3 weeks and started seeing the ego's mechanism clearly, now it's time to experiment with a different way of living. Instead of starting each day with the question, what do I need to do to feel better? Start with the realization. In this moment, nothing is lacking. This isn't a positive affirmation you're trying to convince yourself to believe. This is direct observation of reality. Right now, when you don't carry the story of past or future, when you're simply present, is anything lacking? Try this in simple daily activities. When you make morning coffee, instead of letting your mind wander to the work you need to do that day, be completely present with the act of making coffee. Feel the heat from the water, hear the sound of pouring, smell the coffee. In that moment, when you're completely here, is anything lacking? Or is there just a full experience of life happening? When you talk to someone, instead of half listening while your mind thinks about what you'll say next, listen completely. No judgment, no comparison, no preparing a response. Simply be present with that person. You'll discover that when you listen from emptiness, not from the ego with its opinions and reactions, a different quality of connection appears. And in that connection, there's no feeling of lack. This doesn't mean you stop having goals or stop taking action. You can still work, learn, grow, but no longer from a foundation of lack. When you act from fullness, that action has a different quality. It doesn't carry the tension of having to prove something. It's not driven by the fear of not being good enough. It's simply a natural response of life to circumstances, like how flowers bloom not to prove anything, but simply because that's their nature. Recognize when the ego returns. One important thing to understand is the ego won't disappear permanently after a few weeks of practice. It's been nurtured your entire life, and it has very subtle ways of returning. Sometimes it will return as a spiritual desire. I want to achieve enlightenment. I want to become completely free. And suddenly, you're back in the same cycle, only this time with a more noble goal. That's why the most important practice isn't achieving some state, but continuously recognizing when the ego is operating. Every day, multiple times a day, stop and check, am I acting from lack or from fullness right now? If you're feeling stressed, if you're trying too hard, if you're comparing yourself to others, that's a clear sign. The ego is in control. When you recognize this, don't blame yourself. Don't turn recognizing the ego into another way for the ego to criticize itself. Just see, the ego is operating. And in that clear seeing, nothing needs to be done. The seeing itself is the transformation. Just as when you turn on a light in a dark room, darkness doesn't need to be chased away. It automatically disappears. When you see the ego clearly, it loses its power and a space opens up for natural presence. There will be days you forget. There will be days you get completely swept into the story of lack. That's okay. This isn't a competition to become perfect. This is a journey of gradual awakening. Not awakening to some destination, but awakening from the dream that you need to get somewhere. Each moment you realize you've been swept away and return to presence, you're reinforcing a new way of living. A way of living not based on lack, but based on the realization that you've always been enough. Closing. There's a beautiful paradox in everything we've explored. You cannot achieve fullness because the effort to achieve is itself an affirmation that you're not enough. You cannot become free because trying to become is itself imprisonment. You cannot seek peace because the seeker is the source of unrest. So what remains? Only this, the simple realization that what's feeling the lack, the ego with all its stories, desires, and fears, isn't you. It's just a psychological structure, a habit of mind, a ghost that's been believed to be real for so long. And when you see this clearly, not through theory but through direct observation, a door opens. That door doesn't lead anywhere else. It opens right here in this moment. It's the realization that life needs no proof, that presence needs no improvement, that you don't need to become anyone to exist completely. All that's needed is for you to stop believing the story of lack, not by convincing yourself, but by looking straight at it until it dissolves on its own. This isn't a long journey. It doesn't require years of practice or extraordinary effort. It requires only one thing, the willingness to stop and look. Look at what's feeling the lack. Look at what's chasing. Look at what's afraid. And in that non-judgmental looking, that looking without trying to fix, a miracle happens. The ego loses its foothold, and what remains is you. Not you as an idea, but you as pure presence, needing nothing to be complete. Nothing is lacking. Never was. Only a long dream of lack has obscured this simple truth. And now, if you're willing, you can wake up, not someday in the future, but right in this moment, as you read these lines, as you breathe, as you simply are here. Fullness isn't what you seek. It's what you are when you stop seeking.